What's up, guys? Welcome back to our mini series. Today we are talking about the Pittsburgh Steelers and their fantasy relevancy. Last year they finished behind the Baltimore Ravens, but at 8-8, and this was without Ben Roethlisberger for almost all the year. They were a game out of the playoffs with Mason Rudolph and Devlin Hodges.
Duck Hodges.
Duck Hodges. So, if Roethlisberger comes back, and I mean he's coming back, but if he could stay the whole season, then I could definitely see this team being in the playoffs. We'll talk about our projections a little bit later. As far as the quarterbacks go, Roethlisberger, we just talked about, I could see him at about a little under 4,000 yards, 3,998 yards. 27 touchdowns, 14 interceptions, another 100 yards rushing with a touchdown on the ground, putting him right in the middle of the pack as far as fantasy points go for him. He's not. I mean, the last season that he played in full, he had over 5,000 yards passing, but he
That's
is
nothing.
but he's not. I think he's going to take a little bit of a step back from that, try to get a little bit more into a rhythm of running. Between the last couple of years, they've drafted a couple running backs. They still have James Conner there, so um, I could see them being a little bit more of a running team. But he's still going to want to throw the ball. He's still going to be fantasy relevant. We're going to talk about his wide receivers too. He's got a nice quad of wide receivers that could be decent in any of your formats, and they picked up a nice tight end this offseason too. But behind him, as we mentioned, Devlin Hodges, Mason Rudolph, they brought in Paxton Lynch. Not really anything none of them are threatening Ben's job, but if Ben were to go down, and obviously he went down last year, which one of these guys steps in and tries to help out this team and bring them to the playoffs? Because they got the talent around them. They just need somebody under center to kind of do it. So what's your thoughts on Ben, and what's your thoughts on the backups to Ben?
I mean, we already saw what happens when Ben goes down for fantasy purposes. Juju was awful last season. And, it's kind of hard to judge Juju a little bit because Antonio Brown was gone, but we'll talk about that later. But one of the things, and it's funny, I was talking about this with one of my coworkers the other day who's a big Steelers fan. Why have the Steelers not drafted a replacement for Ben? I mean, are they that confident that he's going to be lasting years and years? I mean, I guess they must be, but I think it's crazy. I've expected them to draft a replacement. We thought that was potentially Mason Rudolph. After seeing him get a shot last year, it is definitely not Mason Rudolph. So, I mean, this offense from a fantasy standpoint is disastrous without Mason Rudolph. On a side note, how cruel of you not to give Ben Roethlisberger 2 more yards for 4,000. How disrespectful.
Can't do it. I don't want him to get that bonus.
Well, overall, I mean, I'm a bigger Ben hater, not in terms of his career. I mean, he's a future Hall of Famer, and I don't have any qualms about that. But, I mean, from a fantasy standpoint, I just have a problem taking a 38-year-old quarterback coming off elbow surgery. I mean, when you throw the ball, I mean, you use your elbow. I mean, he's 38 years old. I mean, it was a major surgery. This wasn't like, he bruised his elbow. I mean, he had a pretty severe, this is a equivalent of, Tommy John surgery for baseball pitchers. So I just don't have confidence in him. And I get that he threw for 5,000 yards. And at this point in his career, he's not mobile. He doesn't really offer any upside in terms of rushing ability. We've talked about that previously when discussing QBs. Is in today's game, you feel like you almost need a guy that offers at least 300 yards on the ground. And I mentioned Daniel Jones before. Drew Lock even didn't run the ball a ton with Denver last year, but he's fairly mobile. He does have the ability to scramble a little bit. So, I just feel like I'd rather take a chance. He's going to be your second QB. I hope for your fantasy team he's not your starter. And I mean, so realistically, if you're drafting a backup quarterback, that's what he is. And I just rather take a chance on a young guy with more upside. I have a lot of concerns with Ben as a 38-year-old coming off major surgery, and I don't know if he's ever going to return to that form. And now he's the kind of guy that'll prove me wrong, but until I see otherwise, I'm just hesitant.
Yeah, he's more of a guy that you're going to play in matchups specifically.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about, I mean, I think we're both on the same page as we think this is one of the top 3 defenses in the league. So we're going to see a lot of games where 17-10, 17-14, and so you're not getting a lot of fantasy output from your from the starters on this team. It's more so they're going to win games with their defense and maybe a little bit of the running game, which we're going to get into next here. So they got a handful of guys. I mean, James Conner is the number one, but like I said, over the past 2 years, they drafted a couple guys in the fourth round. This past year, they drafted Anthony McFarland, and then the year before, they drafted Benny Snell. They have Jalen Samuels on the roster, who's not really a big threat, but he has, especially in time that James Conner has missed. Jalen Samuels came in, and I remember 2 years ago he was a huge hot commodity because he had dual eligibility. He had the tight end tag on him in Yahoo leagues, so you're able to play him as a tight end, but also get running back stats from him. It's kind of a cheat code there. They kind of fixed that. He's just a running back slash fullback now. That I mean, obviously, it would need an injury to James Conner for Samuels or any of these other guys to be more relevant, but I think they're going to be more of a committee backfield. Conner, he's going to get a bulk of the work, but I mean, they didn't bring these guys in for nothing. Conner has had not only like physical injuries, but he's also had he's overcame cancer. I mean, so that he kind of wears down late into the season. You can definitely tell the past couple of years too. He's kind of worn down a little bit. So they're going to try to keep him fresh as much as they can. Again, they were only one game out of the playoffs last year, so you get one more win somewhere on that roster, somewhere on that team over that schedule last year, and you preserve James Conner for the playoffs to run in there against teams like Baltimore and try to get a run game going against Tennessee and stuff like that. But so that's where Benny Snell and Anthony McFarland come in. I don't really think they're gonna be too fantasy relevant, but as far as the Steelers go as a whole, it's gonna definitely dip into James Conner's production.
Yeah, and I know we've discussed James Conner at length internally. I don't know how much to buy into the coach speak of Mike Tomlin saying we want a bell cow back, and he's been very public in saying James Conner's my guy. James Conner's my guy, but I mean, I just can't see him coming out publicly and saying James Conner stinks and he's going to ride the bench. That's why coach speak is so challenging. You always want to believe it because you're like, I mean, this is directly coming from the source. How could they lie? But I mean, that's a reality. These guys are trying to manage these players and their egos and their confidence and all of the above. So I like James Conner. I hope that he can stay healthy. And we don't like talking about that, but that's a reality with him. I mean, he has conditions that make him more likely to get injured. He's ranked number one on a lot of medical sites in terms of his likelihood to get injured. But if he's on the field 16 games, he's going as a back end RB2. He'll way outproduce that ADP. But I'm just hesitant. Even last year when he was on the field, he was only on the field for about 51% of the snaps. So it really was a timeshare with him and Samuels and Benny Snell and all the above. So I worry about James Conner's production. I'm more comfortable taking him as my flex, and if he provides high RB2 value, that's a league-winning decision. And if he falters, I'm going to find my flex elsewhere. So that's kind of where I stand on him. I love Anthony McFarland. I think Anthony McFarland is most likely the future of this backfield. James Conner is a free agent after this season, so Conner might have one more productive year in him, but I think that's why they took Anthony McFarland, even though he wasn't a high-round pick. Anthony McFarland was one of the most underrated backs in this class, and I know a lot of scouts really liked him. I think on day one, he's the most explosive running back that they have on this roster. James Conner's a solid running back, but he's not as explosive as McFarland is. So I love taking McFarland late in drafts. If James Conner does go down, I mean, this is Anthony McFarland's backfield to me. We saw what Jalen Samuels and Benny Snell did last year. It was very, very underwhelming. Jalen Samuels, if anything, is more of a third down complementary kind of piece. Benny Snell, I think, is just an old school plotter, in my opinion. He's a guy you throw on the 1 yard line and he gets you a touchdown. So I could see him stealing some touchdowns. But Anthony McFarland's the only guy on this roster that I can say, yeah, I think he has the potential to be explosive and a 3-down back. So I like his value right now going later in draft. He's going as like the 45th running back off the board. So way late in drafts. And I mean, if he ended up starting in Pittsburgh because Connor went down or just because they like what they saw, I mean, that's a league-winning kind of decision. So I love taking young running backs with upside, and I think McFarland fits that perfectly.
All right, moving on to their offensive line. They got one of the best offensive lines in the league. Their left tackle Villanueva is he's been pretty solid for a couple of years. Marquise Pouncey, one of the better centers in the entire league. David DeCastro, one of the better interior linemen in the entire league. Just overall, I mean, there's no reason why anybody who's running the ball can't run the ball with these guys in front of them, and then there's no reason why they can't keep Ben Roethlisberger upright for him to stay healthy. So, any thoughts on their offensive line?
Yeah, they're ranked ninth by Pro Football Focus. They're pretty almost every season in the top 10. David DeCastro, the note that Pro Football Focus has here is that his run blocking took a big hit last year. They had Ramon Foster at the other guard spot last year, and he retired. They got Steven Wisnowski from he was with the Chiefs last season, and he's been very solid for them. But overall, it's a top 10 unit. They're a lot stronger in the run game than the pass game, and that doesn't surprise you. I mean, as much as they have Ben Roethlisberger, the Steelers have been known for their ground and pound game throughout their history with Mike Tomlin as their head coach. So, very strong offensive line, and it only helps their running game.
All right, moving on to their wide receivers. They got a lot of solid solid guys here. They drafted one this year in Chase Claypool in the second round. Their starting three seem to be Juju Smith-Schuster, James Washington, and Deontay Johnson, who I know you have a lot to say about. I couldn't go without saying Anthony Johnson, even though he's probably not going to do anything. He played here at the University of Buffalo, and I thought that he was going to be. He actually came out of the league undrafted last year, and I thought that like it wasn't that deep of a wide receiver class, and he didn't get drafted, so his career's not off to a great start. But even above him, you got Ryan Switzer and Deion Kane, a couple guys who have seen a little bit of time in this league. We covered some of the XFL, so Saeed Blacknell is a name that we know. But like they're they're waiting for like injuries and trades and stuff to happen for any of them to be relevant. Let's talk about these top four in Juju, Washington, Deontay Johnson, and Chase Claypool.
Yeah, so starting off with, well, just a general comment on their depth chart. I think it's kind of interesting. They have Deontay Johnson listed as the slot wide receiver, and he only ran 10% of his routes out of the slot last year, and Juju ran almost 60. So, just kind of an interesting note. I expect Juju to run more of, even though he has that stigma. Deontay Johnson's smaller, so he's a slot receiver. And, that's not necessarily always a great assumption. Juju did run a majority of the routes in the slot last year. Man, I don't get the Juju hype, I guess. I mean, call me crazy, but I had high expectations for him last year, and obviously that didn't work out with Ben going down, and he struggled quite a bit, but he's going as the 11th wide receiver off the board right now. I guess I don't get it. I mean, he struggled so much last year why would you want to take this guy as your number one wide receiver? I mean, to me, I'm not taking him off the board until maybe my third wide receiver. And I get it. He's going to improve because Ben's there this year, and he's much better than Mason Rudolph and Duck Hodges. But I'm just not confident enough in Juju being a top-tier guy. I mean, 11th overall. You would think after such a bust season last year, this is a guy that'd be going in the 30s. But here we are, and he's going in the second, third round. So I think that's insane to me. I don't really get it. The one thing I do worry about him is all the attention is on him. I mean, I love Deontay Johnson, and I think he'll get more attention as the season goes on. But, I'm kind of questioning. Everybody had their attention on Antonio Brown when he was there. Juju had a lot of openings, a lot of one-on-ones, and he was beating guys one-on-one. But all of a sudden, if you're the guy, does he have the ability to beat double teams, to face a team's top corner every single week? I don't know. I mean, maybe. I'm not going to say no, but I'm not confident enough in taking him as my number one wide receiver yet. So I think that's insane right now. I'd watch out for that hype because at the best, I mean, I think you're leaving yourself very little room for him to outperform his ADP if you're taking him 11th wide receiver off the board. In terms of Deontay Johnson, I've written a few articles about him now, but he's currently the 38th wide receiver off the board. last 5 weeks of the year last season, he was a 17th wide receiver, so he did show a little bit of wide receiver 2 upside. So nice value there. I mean, for me, the biggest thing, he was a rookie last season, and you could just see week to week that he was improving towards the end of the year. And I mean, that's what you want to see from a rookie. Sometimes they struggle to get into their groove early in the year, and we've mentioned that pretty significantly for this season, specifically with the question marks around training camp and no preseason. But I mean, you like to see rookies that are improving, and now Deontay is going to go into his second full year here with a lot of momentum, a better quarterback. So I have a lot of faith in him. One of the things I really like is he was number one in target separation last year. And that sounds kind of crazy, but essentially that means he's getting open. I mean, if you want to put it simply. So he's running really clean routes, and he's giving guys the opportunity, his quarterback the opportunity to get him the ball. And last year they were not doing a great job at getting him the ball, but I think Ben Roethlisberger will do better this season. So I like his value. Kind of the forgotten guy right now is James Washington, who's going to be playing on the outside. But he was actually really good last year, surprisingly. He has 735 yards, which even when we were prepping this, I was like, did he actually have that many yards last season? I mean, he went really under the radar, only 44 receptions. So, I mean, he's their deep ball threat. And to me, and maybe people won't like this, but I think he's just a Deshaun Jackson type of guy. I mean, that's why I don't think he'll interfere with Deontay Johnson and Juju that much. They're better route runners and more complete wide receivers. James Washington's the kind of guy, he's a burner. You run him on a fly route, and I like him with Ben a lot. I think Ben will be able to bomb the ball to him, and you could see James Washington have a nice season. Currently going as a 75th wide receiver off the board, so at that point, he's either going undrafted or you're in a really deep league, so why not at that point?
Exactly. Any thoughts on Chase Claypool?
Yeah, I mean, Chase Claypool, yeah, this team actually goes 4 deep, so he's a bigger target. I think year one he's going to be more involved in the red zone. Because when you look at Juju, James Washington, and Deontay Johnson, those 3 guys have never been red zone threats. So Chase Claypool is a big body. I think coming in day one, him and Ebron will probably be their top guys in the red zone. But outside of that, until they get rid of one of those top 3 guys, I think Claypool's upside will be kind of limited.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. It's going to take a little bit for Claypool to really be on your in your starting roster, even as a flex, because they do have Johnson, Washington, and Juju on there. And you perfect segue into the next group that we're going to talk about, the tight ends. They brought in Eric Ebron, who's probably going to be Ben's favorite red zone target if Claypool is not on the field. Vance McDonald, we've seen him with some nice stiff arms and running people over the past couple of years, but Eric Ebron I think is the better receiver of the two. Vance is a better pass blocker. Ebron, we saw him 2 years ago in Indy just kind of light things up. Last year was kind of a disappointment. He boosted his draft stock before last fantasy season, and it kind of disappointed people. Came over to Pittsburgh and just adds another weapon for Ben Roethlisberger. So if anything, that's going to help him out. I think he's going to have a pretty decent year there in Pittsburgh. Probably going to see a lot of. I mean, it's hard to say because are we going to see a lot of 2 tight end sets with Vance and Ebron, or are we going to see more 3 wide receiver sets with the guys that we mentioned? You still got the running backs out there. You got James Conner that's going to be out there. So there's a lot of personnel that they could put out there at any given time, and it's just hard to really pinpoint like who's going to be making the most of their opportunity. I mean, Connor's going to be one of those guys that are drafted in all leagues and all formats. So you're going to be playing him in a running back position. Juju, if you're taking him as the 11th wide receiver, or even in the top 15, 20, you're most likely putting him on the field. Or you're putting him in your roster. So he's going to be on the field too. Washington and Johnson are a little lower, and then McDonald and Ebron are a little lower. But it's like if you take them, do you play them and risk a big fat zero because they're not playing them, or what? So what are your thoughts on the tight ends here?
So I'm not as high on Eric Ebron as other people are. I think he's going fairly in drafts right now. He's a 19th tight end off the board, but the only big season we've seen from him, and you kind of mentioned this, was 2 years ago in 2018. I mean, what happened that year. Jack Doyle missed almost the entire season.
Yeah.
So he was the guy. So to me, it's a little fluky, and it's one of those situations, and that's why I always tell people to look forward and not behind in fan. And I love stats, and you need to use those, but you need to realize how they change moving forward, I think sometimes. And that's the case where he was the only tight end on the roster. It was a very tight end heavy scheme, so of course he's going to get more volume. But this situation, it's kind of the same reason. That's the reason why I really don't like Ebron that much this season. Is I think Vance McDonald and Jack Doyle are kind of similar. And we're not 100% sure if they're going to run two tight end sets, and they're definitely not as tight end heavy as the Colts are right now. But I do think that Vance McDonald's going to be involved a little bit. And when you're looking at a breakout tight end, I want a guy that I'm 100% confident is the guy at tight end. And as much as I think Ebron's more talented of a tight end than Vance McDonald, I just worry we're looking at an Ebron and Jack Doyle situation again. So that's my biggest concern. And when you look at his stats, so if you look at what he did last year with Doyle on the field, he was 16th in points per game last year, and he's going as the 19th tight end off the board this year. So, pretty close. Maybe he offers a few spots of value there, but overall, I'm just not as confident, I guess, as other people because of that dynamic.
All right. Moving on to the special teams. Chris Boswell, he's a decent kicker. He's been around with Pittsburgh for a little while now, but they also play in a colder climate. None of their divisional opponents play in a dome or anything like that. Baltimore's outside, Cleveland's outside, Cincinnati's outside. So when you get into November, December, you are looking at a lot of colder weather, possibly windy, snowy games. And then that coupled with other games on the schedule. I know they have Buffalo on the schedule in Buffalo, and that's later on in the season, so that's another outdoor game that could be in the cold. So the offense could put up some points as long as everybody stays healthy. Ben Roethlisberger can move the ball, and that'll give Boswell some opportunity to kick you some points there. But we typically like to target guys that are in warmer weather in domes and on high octane offenses, where this team is probably going to be fueled by the defense. So you might get in a 17-14 game, you might get a field goal and 2 extra points, but that's, you can't really rely on that every game, and with the defense, it's probably going to be a lot of low scoring games there.
Yeah, at this point, when you take a kicker, for me, you're just trying to play the odds. When you look at the top 12 kickers last year, 3 of them were were outside of domes. So, at that point, Chris Boswell actually was one of them. He was number 12, exactly. That hasn't been standard when you look at his career. Typically the Steelers pound the ball into the end zone. So, that's less field goal opportunities. Last year, I think it's a little fluky because that offense wasn't as good. They got stalled a lot more field goal opportunities for Chris Boswell. But in general, when I was looking back at the last few years, usually 10 of the top 12 guys are dome kickers, and the only one that's not is Justin Tucker normally, but that guy's just kind of in his own category. So overall, I probably wouldn't take Boswell. And he checks almost all of the boxes because solid offense, but it's just that weather that gets you.
And then we like to throw in some kick and punt returners there. Deontay Johnson adds a little bit in the return game, looking like he's going to return some punts there. So if you get some points for that, he's a good option there. The other guys that they got that are returning kicks and punts are more on the defensive side. So unless you're in an IDP league or specifically return league where you could play a return player, then they're pretty irrelevant. But Deontay Johnson, if that adds a little bit of value to him. And then now on to the bread and butter of this team. It's weird because a couple years ago we were talking about the offense being the bread and butter with Ben Roethlisberger, Le'Veon Bell, Antonio Brown. Now we're talking about Ben Roethlisberger's still there, but Bell and Brown are gone, and the defense is what kind of carried this team last year to an 8-8 record and almost making the playoffs. Independently, they got T.J. Watt, Devin Bush, Bud Dupree, Joe Hayden, Micah Fitzpatrick, Terrell Edmonds. They got a nice handful of guys that you could put on any IDP leagues. Obviously, your Minka Fitzpatrick, your Terrell Edmonds, Watt, and Bush are going to be the bigger guys. Those are going to be the guys that get your tackles and your interceptions and stuff like that, and get you your fantasy points. Joe Hayden is one of the better. I mean, he's kind of slipped a little bit, but he's still a solid top end cornerback. So teams really aren't going to throw his way per se. They might throw to the other side. So he's not really fantasy relevant. But as a whole, this is I've seen them go off as the number one defense on the board in mock drafts, and like just in the eighth round too. Like somebody taking their first defense, they're taking the Pittsburgh Steelers in the eighth round, which is it's insane to me. But that's the way some people draft. If you want to have, I mean, I wouldn't even call it a position advantage, but if you want to go in there and grab the number one of a position, and you take the defense, and Pittsburgh is probably it.
Yeah, I would agree. And to me, I'm not a Steelers fan, but this just feels like a Steelers team. I mean, when you think about the history of the Steelers, you just think of hard-nosed defenses. I mean, that's been what they've been known for the past 40 years. So, I'd like to see them returning back to what they were previously. So, in terms of fantasy production, they were second last year as a unit in total points. So, they really performed well there. A few individuals. Cameron Hayward on the defensive line was third in points among defensive linemen. He had 83 tackles as a defensive lineman. I mean, you never see that. And 9 sacks. So he has a lot of value as one of the top defensive linemen. I mean, I can't think of many times where I've seen a defensive lineman get 83 tackles. Tua is kind of an interesting stash if you're in dynasty leagues. He's shown flashes that he can be really good, and it's once again one of those situations where, I mean, he's the fourth pass rusher on this team when you consider Hayward, TJ Watt, Bud Dupree. I mean, he's really probably the fourth pass rusher there, so not a lot of pressure on him. So he looked pretty good last year. I think he's only 27 right now, so I'd stash him if you're in a deep dynasty league. Devin Bush, I really liked him. He had a really impressive rookie season last year. They're starting inside linebacker. He was a 17th ranked linebacker last season in terms of how many points he scored. Had 109 tackles, and that's as a rookie, and I think you always expect them to improve. TJ Watt was 7th in points among linebackers. He had 14 and a half sacks last year, one of the top linebackers off the board. But even more impressively, he had 8 forced fumbles. I mean, that is a ton. I mean, this guy he's one of the best linebackers in the league, and he's fun to watch. Bud Dupree, same thing, had 11 and a half sacks last year, 19th linebacker off the board, probably more of a second linebacker. I'm not overly confident in him because you're looking for, I mean, sacks get you points, but they're less consistent. That's why I like guys that get a lot of tackles, because on a weekly basis, you can expect them, okay, they're going to get 8 to 10 tackles, where if you're relying on a guy and crossing your fingers that he gets 2 to 3 sacks, I don't like playing that game as much with IDPs. I mean, you can try to play matchups and see a weak offensive line, and that offers some opportunity, but I like tackles. So Bud Dupree's probably more a back-end second linebacker if you play 2 linebackers. Terrell Edmonds, one of the 3 T. Edmond brothers, he had 105 tackles from the strong safety position. So I think he's going to he's still young. He's a high upside, strong safety, and a really strong defense. And then I wanted to finish on Minkah Fitzpatrick, because Fitzpatrick is probably one of the most valuable safeties in all of football. But this is one of those situations where he's not that valuable for fantasy purposes. And I think a lot of people get sucked in and they say, ooh, Minkah Fitzpatrick, he's good. But I mean, he was 21st in points last year for DBs. He's not really a guy that gets a ton of tackles. He intercepts a lot of passes. He's all over the field. He's an important playmaker, but he's just not fantasy relevant in terms of how most IDP leagues are scored. So if there's something where you score your IDP strangely, maybe he is, but I wouldn't get sucked in with him.
All right, good analysis of the IDPs and defense as a whole. Final thoughts on them. Like I said, they finished 8-8 in the division behind Baltimore. I do think Baltimore is going to take a little bit of a step back, but they're still going to finish first in the division. Instead of being 14-2, maybe 12-4, something like that, 11-5. I could see the Steelers being about 10-6 or so, but they added a 7th wild card this year. I think Pittsburgh has all the tools to make a wild card as long as everybody on the offense stays healthy. The whole division as a whole, I think, got a little bit better. The Bengals, especially, they ended up with the first overall pick, drafted Joe Burrow. They essentially get AJ Green back. So just overall, I think the Bengals are going to be better, but not enough to really threaten the Steelers or the Ravens. The Browns are hit or miss. I mean, last year we talked about them going into the season and maybe finally turning it around and being not the same old Browns anymore, and they ended up being the same old Browns. And they're bringing back a lot of that team. Their defense is still good. Their offense has two of the better wide receivers and two of the better running backs that you could ask for. Baker Mayfield, I think, could take another step forward. So it's going to be a tough between the Steelers and the Browns for 2 and 3, but I would give the edge of the Steelers.
Yeah, and I mean, you know how much I read into head coaching situations. And I mean, Mike Tomlin to me is the second best head coach in the NFL. So I'd give him the advantage over the Browns and Bengals because Mike Tomlin's going to make sure they show up and play. I mean, they almost made the playoffs last season with garbage at quarterback. I mean, that's all you need to know about Mike Tomlin. And he just, I mean, I wish Mike Tomlin was the coach of the Rams. And I don't like Sean McVay. That's a whole nother conversation.
Literal
But
garbage cans, huh?
yeah, I mean, they probably would have been better with the garbage cans than Mason Rudolph, because at least they wouldn't have thrown interceptions. They could have just handed the ball off, maybe. But yeah, I mean, I think they can win the division. I mean, that's crazy to say because I know how much everybody loves the Ravens, and I love Lamar too, and I love the Ravens, and I love how their team is built. But I just think Mike Tomlin's gonna make sure that they're ready to play. Would I say they're absolutely going to win the division? No, I would definitely have them as a wild card, and I think they'll be in the thick of things to compete for the division.
All right, so there you have it, the Pittsburgh Steelers. We'll see you guys next episode.